welcome back to our podcast.
This month, we had on the Senior Manager of Consulting at the Oklahoma City Center for Nonprofits. Dallas, what did you enjoy about our discussion?
I really liked discussing with her direct work with civic engagement and civic education and how disinformation can affect that. How about you? What was your favorite part?
I enjoyed when she talked about the generational differences and like how we different generations learned about misinformation and also how we interacted with it. I thought that was really interesting.
Definitely, yes. We know you guys will love this episode, and yes, keep watching.
Welcome, and thank you for coming. To start off, we were wondering if you could describe your academic background and then leading into your professional work.
Yeah, for sure. So how far do you want me to go back? I graduated from Enid High School in 1996, very unsure of what I wanted to do. And so I went to the University of Oklahoma, got a bachelor's in letters degree, so a bachelor's in arts and science, focusing on literature, history, philosophy, and just kind of a general overarching liberal arts degree. And then I went on, I got my master's in religious education. And that's where I did a lot of work around youth development, both, physical, like how students develop like brain science, but also just how young people think about the world and build their worldview over time. So I did that. And I have not been in school formally for over 20 years. But that is kind of the background. And then professionally, I took that and I started my career in youth and child's ministry, youth and children's ministry. And again, really focusing on kind of from a religious perspective, what are some healthy ways that young people can develop their faith in a way that is honest and true, but also, healthy as we kind of started to understand the world differently. Then I started running my first nonprofit, where we did literacy camps for young people. And I worked with a lot of college students and then obviously the kids there. And then I did some nonprofit work in social services. And then Lauren, where I met you with Generation Citizen, started doing that. So civics education. And that's where a lot of it kind of came together, from really understanding both brain science and how young people are experiencing the world at different phases of development, into how we're understanding policy and politics and engaging with media and all of that. So it sort of all came together then. And currently I am doing some consulting for nonprofits for a statewide organization here based out of Oklahoma City, but we work across the state.
Thank you so much for that. My question for you is, through your educational and professional background that you just described, were you taught about misinformation and disinformation and how to detect it if you come across it?
This was not something, to my recollection, that we talked about at all during my formal education. So it was not, it wasn't discussed. It was very, you assumed that people in the media were telling you the truth, and that there was, one very linear story. And, that was also sort of the thinking of the time about religious education. So there's one view based on, kind of how you come to understand your faith, and whatever that view is, there's a very straight one path strand. And so I think that's when I started kind of thinking, we are humans, and humans are much more complicated than that. So I started thinking about it. As I was preparing to talk to you all today, I started thinking about something that was somewhat unique to my generation. I was in third grade when our teacher rolled a television into our classroom, and we watched live footage of the Challenger. And so I'm sure you all recall, it was a big, the United States at that point was in the middle of or maybe the beginning of the space race, and really wanting to make sure that we had the best technology for space exploration in the world. And so one of the ways that they felt like we were getting behind was there's a lot of information about how, other countries put more emphasis on science and math than the United States did, and kind of, they were going to solve that problem. So one of the ways that they thought they would solve that problem was this really media, at the time it just felt like, how cool, this teacher's going to the moon. But, now that I know more, it really was kind of a media campaign around who is someone that students, that young people think most highly of and really respect, and how can we make them front and center of the space race. And so that is when they had the competition. They ultimately had a teacher who went to space, and as you all know how that story ended, we were sitting in our classrooms and literally watched the Challenger explode. And what I recall about that was the TV went off, they wheeled it out, and they said, pull out your books, and we just went on with school. And so while that wasn't, I don't fault our teachers, I don't think they had any plan for that. And as an educator myself, that would have been a really bad day as an educator for a lot of reasons. But I think it has to do with misinformation and disinformation, in that when you just end the story, kind of like shut it off and don't continue on with the story, that narrative is left open for all of those kids and their families to just kind of write their ending to that story from lots of different ways. So I would say that's kind of the youngest memory I have of this topic, but to my recollection, there was no formal instruction or comments about that.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on this linear way of thinking, and you definitely talked about how it affected, how disinformation and misinformation affected you. I was wondering if you could expand more on the personal impacts that this misinformation, disinformation have had on you, either directly or indirectly, throughout both your education and then your professional background.
Yeah, I think one, this makes me feel old because I know things are very different now. But for me, I grew up in Enid, Oklahoma, very much trusting the media, both at the state level and at the municipal level. It wasn't until I was at OU and started seeing how other people had experienced things differently than me, and that it wasn't always positive, that it even occurred to me that there would be other ways. And it was a junior or senior in college before I really made those connections. And I think the biggest impact at first was I became very distrusting, to where I didn't really believe anything anyone told me. And I very much relied on my own lived experience, and how I either experienced it or thought about it or whatever. And then it wasn't until much later than that, this is probably embarrassing, but really much later than that, outside of my own field. So in my field, I felt like I was really engaged and knew what was true and what wasn't true, and could kind of filter those things. But outside of my field, it was much later before I really took into account that people have very different lived experiences, therefore they're experiencing that very differently than me. And so, some of those big things were, they happened honestly when I was having children. I was at home with a baby when, what was it? Oh, there was the situation where the people were stuck in, or those miners were stuck in the well, and or in the mine, and they couldn't get them out. And I remember, because I was feeding my baby every so many hours, I would go and I would turn it on, and I was like, what on earth is happening, and how are we? But then another one that happened was with Hurricane Katrina, and seeing so many different perspectives on that. But again, that was the early 2000s when those things were happening. So prior to that, I think it was very linear. And just one of the things I also remembered thinking about this was when I was in high school, Desert Storm was happening, or middle school and high school, Desert Storm was happening. And I don't know if y'all have YouTube, like looked at YouTube and like videos, but at night after the news, they would just turn on like this live stream and it would just be dark of whatever, wherever they were. And you would see explosions and there'd be like light commentary, but not commentary like you see today. And I remember it was so significant to my parents that my dad would get out our VHS recorder and like record them because he thought that this was like this history, And so at that time, so middle school, high school for me, media looked like, here's a live camera, make of it what you will. And of course, that has its own problems because people would say, well, if you could just look at what's happening, then obviously you know what's true, but you're still only seeing one perspective from a camera view of one place positioned, for one, someone made that decision of where it's positioned, what times it's being shown, all of those things. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I would say it wasn't until the early 2000s that I was really seeing in the media representation of issues and situations that I knew I didn't have the full perspective on.
Thank you. So you touched on your experiences, but now I want to ask, in your career, since you work at the intersection of students and news literacy, how have you seen misinformation, disinformation, and even bias in the news affect students as a whole, or specific examples?
Generally, like broad brush, it's changing, but for a long time it was they didn't want to be involved or care about it. It wasn't that they didn't care, like they were indifferent. They were, young people seemed very disengaged because they didn't know who to trust. And they didn't want to make the wrong decision and like fall into the trap of like believing something that ultimately hurt folks. And so they really disengaged. More recently, I think that young people are starting to find sources where like check their work and like see if something feels weird, it really probably is weird and they should look into it more. So I see more of that. But I think that also has to do with access to education that encourages that kind of inquiry, which is it's not evenly distributed. And then also, a lot of young people and their families if you have a lot of, you're impacted deeply by housing challenges, food, all of your basic necessities, then this is the last thing you're thinking about. You're just trying to get to the next thing. So it's limiting in that if you don't have, everything's not going your way and you're not in a supportive environment, they're still disengaging. But those who are in a supportive environment with their basic needs met seem to be having more success.
So when it comes to students, what are some like tips and what's the best way for students and individuals in general to stay vigilant on social media when encountering or coming across like misinformation and disinformation?
I think you have to take a lot of responsibility on yourself to educate yourself in what the topic is. And right now in nonprofit world, we're also talking about AI. And to me, it's like the same concepts. You're not going to have someone, you're not going to have Chat GPT or something write a speech for you that you know nothing about, because you could be talking about something completely embarrassing and you'll make a fool of yourself. But if you know generally the top, like where you're going, you can put some things in and you can get a pretty quality, mini speech or I don't know, cover letter or something through Chat GPT and feel pretty confident about it. I think it's kind of similar in exploring topics through social media, is you have to know enough about the topic to be able to flag when something is absolutely false, to know when like that sounds kind of real, but I just don't trust that source. Then you would go deeper. Like there are lots of things that would kind of bring up a red flag. I think if you know enough, then you can it's useful. If you don't know anything, or if you're really in a mood or at a developmental phase where you are particularly distrusting, or I guess vice versa, really trusting, you should probably stay away from it, because it's the way things are happening now. It's so interesting, even with there are things in Oklahoma and at the national level where I think last week they found 67 what formerly was Twitter, accounts that were reporting things that were happening in Israel and the Gaza Strip that were absolutely not just false, but like they started on one topic and then they switched. Once they got people to kind of trust them as a source, they switched to like being disinformation about what was happening in Israel. Similarly, in Oklahoma, there are a lot of concerns right now by a lot of people across party lines about what is it called? PragerU, PragerU, that's what it is. Because they have been known to have disinformation that comes out about historical topics and civic topics in other states, and now they're coming to Oklahoma and will be offered. So if you know that they have a bad reputation, that's where you could easily take caution if you're paying attention.
Definitely, yes. My next question is, well, I'm going to start with this. I'm sure you've heard people sometimes debate on whether content on social media should be regulated, if there should be rules to kind of prevent the massive spread of disinformation. What are your thoughts on that? And how do we, if that were the case, how do we make sure we don't cross free speech lines? And of course, social media, they're private companies, but people are still really hesitant to accept that and think it's somehow blocking opinions. So if you have any thoughts on that, we would love to hear that.
I feel like I have a lot of thoughts and no answers. U.S. District Court just in the last week or two ruled that even disinformation, so not just misinformation, so stating things that they don't realize is not false, but actually stating information that's false to convince people, teach them the wrong thing, give wrong information intentionally, is still protected by the Constitution. So my civics educator in me is, it is all protected by the Constitution as it stands now. I think that's it doesn't really surprise me. This is kind of a new-ish phenomenon for our country. I think that the way people engage with social media, there should be a lot of caution. And when I say caution, there are certain social media platforms that I do not use at all anymore. Not because I can't navigate them for the most part, in my opinion, to get good information, but because I think that they are the values of the company, the way that it's used, the way that they are choosing not to regulate themselves is negative for our democracy. So I'm making that personal choice to do that. I think that there should be some more conversation around how people who are elected or appointed, who are with our government, engage in those platforms similarly for the same reasons. If I see someone who's an elected official in my, that represents me or someone else for that matter, engaging on social media platforms that I know don't share my values around democracy, I have pretty strong feelings that that's not okay. So yeah, like I said, I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't really have any answers. I think it's something people need to pay attention to. I think parents need to pay attention to what social media platforms their students are on. And I know that's hard because I have 2 kids myself, and it is hard to pay attention to what's going on. And the way I handled it was I didn't limit it as much, but if I knew they were on certain social media, it changed the conversations we had as a family to make sure that they were being a little bit more thoughtful about how they consumed that information. And then the other thing I'm a big advocate for, and this is challenging because I'm a nonprofit, and while even though I work at nonprofit, I can still have my own political views and whatnot. I have to be really careful because on social media, some know me from my professional life, and some know me personally, and they get those confused. But if I see something that is absolute mis or disinformation, I typically name it on my social media platforms, because I think that kind of public accountability, particularly at the municipal or the state level, is really important. That they know you can't just say that. Like, you can't make things up, because it does chip away at our democracy and how people trust what's happening around them.
Kind of building off of that, what are some concerns that you have with particularly young people when, consuming information for school or even just like personal to form personal opinions? Well, I guess two-part question. Like, do you think misinformation, disinformation is becoming more and more like prevalent, or do you think it's just having a bigger emphasis? And then also, what are some like concerns that you have, particularly with young people engaging with it?
I think I'm most qualified to talk about, like, from a democracy perspective. So taking away all the personal stuff, I mean, it is, and I will say, I think it is a huge factor in the mental health epidemic that we're seeing with young people across our country and across the globe. So I don't want to diminish that. I think it's really, really hard because people make things, they're trying to create chaos, and that chaos it just looks like no hope for a lot of people who are trying to develop their worldview. So I would name that as like a huge problem and a huge concern, and it makes me very, very angry. But from a democracy standpoint, I think that it chips away at the trust of the foundation of our country, which is, we are a self-governing people. And I think most Americans like being self-governing. And it's something we often take for granted. I think we've taken it for granted probably since the beginning of our country formed. But it's not a given that we will always be self-governing. And so it makes me hope that young people will pay attention and will be vigilant and will, what I say, stay in the arena. Will continue to want to be a part of things. One thing that will heat up a lot for young people, and you all can watch this happen, I can already tell you, is as the 2024 election comes, what you're going to hear is young people are not voting, they are not participating, they are not doing anything. That is people trying to get people to think, well, I have so little and so small, I can't participate because it's not going to make a difference. And then that's when that actually happens. And so I think it is really doing the extra work that you don't get a degree for, you don't get paid for, you don't really even get to put it on your resume, but to stay engaged, even though what you're hearing is information that's trying to keep you from engaging. Because we know that if young people actually did participate in our democracy, whether through voting, holding electeds accountable, all these things, that 18 to 36-year-olds would be making decisions for the entire country. They're just not participating. And people are afraid of that. So they're starting this whole narrative of, not starting, it's been going on, and it will build around general election time, that don't participate, don't do this, it's a waste of your time, it's not going to make a difference, like that kind of thing will be the disinformation and misinformation that's happening.
Scary, but it's true. Definitely will happen. Not ready for that. But my next question is, and you definitely touched on this with the last question, but in what ways do you think believing false information that people see on the internet or wherever will affect their principles and their values and how they will make future decisions, such as voting, or, like you mentioned, deciding not to vote because they think they can make no difference? How much weight do you think that false information carries that they're given, and how do you think it'll shape those decisions that they'll make?
I mean, I don't think it will be good, but I think it just depends on the person a little bit. You know, there'll be the people who just want to opt out. There'll be the people who, and you all know people like that. You know, the folks who are going to opt out. They're just not going to participate, and they're going to say it doesn't impact me. I can't change it. I'm just going to do the best I can. Then there'll be the people who don't want to think about the honest truth because it's scary, and they don't like talking about those things. They don't like conflict. They don't, you know, so they're going to choose to, and they're not looking at the bad stuff. They're looking at the good stuff. Oh, this isn't that big of a deal. Or this is a long way away. Or that particular country or group of people have always had conflict and there's, you know, they're used to it. Those are the negative ways of how people will do it. I think the positive ways are people will continue because we have more access to truth than we've ever had before. And if people will lean into that and just be diligent about naming the true things that they see, and not just the true things as far as like what's happening in a particular situation, but recognizing those are humans, those are mothers with children, those are, you know, young men who have dreams for themselves. Those are countries who, while they may not understand self-governing the way we understand it, would like to have some freedoms for themselves. I think if they will continue to just talk about those things, that eventually it will drown out the false information, because that's the lazy part, is like making up stuff. We now have enough information to do that. And I think it's also about finding like trusted sources, whether it be people you know personally, professors, particular news sources that you trust. I mean, there are some podcasters out there that are doing really incredible stuff, getting really great information out there that are have enough people watching them that if they make a mistake, they're being called out on it at their very, you know, their next episode. So finding those like trusted people so that you have enough confidence to continue to speak the truth will eventually drown out the negative. Otherwise, we're all going to have to wave the right white flag and just say, hey, we're giving up on our, you know, self-governed democracy, because there's not a lot of in between. Like, I don't see this being like a volleyball game that goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Eventually, one will override the other.
You kind of talked about how this, you know, narrative of young people and how it impacts their own like decisions for the future. How do you think, what are some other ways that you think that misinformation and disinformation specifically targets the younger generation and how that impacts their decisions in the future?
This is me trying not to go into all my conspiracy theories, but I think it impacts them in all sorts of ways. Like my generation, Gen X, a lot of my peers came out with like huge college debt. And there were lots of reasons. I mean, part of it was the banks were in many ways saying that money is cheap, money is free, you don't have to pay it back, it'll be all these years, you know, like those kind of things. And shocker, things changed and they actually do have to pay that money back. And so to that, you know, that now we have a whole generation of like my kids who are saying, I don't know if I want to go to college. And if I do, like, I want to make sure that it's like, I can afford it. You know, that has changed. So there's those kind of ways that I think it will impact their decision-making. I think that having more, I'm going to sandwich this, so I'll give the other positive at the end. I think the negative has to do with mental health and self-image and hope for the future. I think that the disinformation of all different forms is really, really challenging on young people who are developing their worldview, because when there's so much negative, I mean, no one is born with like an understanding of the world. Frankly, no one comes out of high school with a full understanding of the world. That beginning of high school through about age 30, you are developing your worldview that's going to inform all of your decisions, your choice to have children, your choice to get married, you know, all of those things. And if you're just inundated by disinformation and misinformation, that makes that look helpless and hopeless, I feel like that puts people in a very negative place and will impact their decision making for the long haul. The other positive counter to that is, like I said, there's more access to truth. And when I say truth, you could actually jump on a call with someone and, wherever you want to right now and have a conversation with people. Like, there's access to those kind of things that we've never had before. And through podcasts and things, there's access to actual like news and that kind of more formal media that we've never had before. With that, I think that's going to make young people much more, and we're seeing it, much more concerned about things like the environment, global warming, women's health, extreme poverty, people experiencing homelessness. They're going to know more about that. Therefore, they're going to make more informed decisions moving forward than previous generations did, because they didn't have access to like what is actually happening on the ground in the way that we do now.
Thank you. My next question for you is, how can we as a state, country, society, world use social media and other means to counter the spread of misinformation, disinformation, and if you would like to add, the second part is, how can we, and I think you touched on this maybe a little bit, but how can we use AI for the same reason?
I think a lot of it's just continuing to use the same tools that misinformation and disinformation are using to like put it out there as like really true, honest things. And it's more than just saying I'm a reliable source, or saying X is not X is in Twitter, but something else is not a reliable source. It's like the proof is in the pudding. So continuing to kind of build that audience, build that reputation, build that brand, whether it be individually or collectively with a group or whatever, and continue to spread that and attract people to continue and spread that way. I still think if there's a platform or a feed that is questionable at all around misinformation, disinformation, anti-democratic, absolutely just stop. Like, even things like posting it, like I have a difference of opinion with some of my colleagues in the democracy world, but posting misinformation or disinformation and saying this is wrong is unhelpful. Just ignore it, throw it away, put it away, and say what is true. Now, if someone that might be a little different, if there's an elected official or someone popular that continues to do that, maybe naming that is one thing, but I would not post anything that is incorrect or at all suspicious, even if you think you're doing good because you think you're naming, well, this is wrong. We know that's not how our brains work. If you see it, the first thing you see is what you're going to believe for many people, like it's your default. So not doing that. And then I think continuing to advocate for all things pro-democracy, voting, paying attention to your elected officials, holding people accountable, all of those things, promoting those on your feeds, like you would promote the latest Taylor Swift concert. Like, people need to see it that often, are the things. And I would say the same thing about AI. I don't get as freaked out about AI as people my age and older do. I think it will ultimately be a useful tool, and either it'll be useful because you're intelligent, you know how to use it appropriately, or it'll be useful because you'll be kind of an idiot and make a fool of yourself, and then we'll be like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, great. So I don't know, I don't get as freaked out about that as other people.
Yeah, thank you so much, that's good. How has misinformation, in your experience, misinformation, disinformation affected people's views on civics education and kind of that weird like relationship that they have and like are deeply impacted by each other?
Well, I just spent 7 years fighting disinformation and misinformation about civics education. It was used in all sorts of ways. It was used to say, if young people learn how to participate in government with their young minds. They will turn into little protesters, and there will be rallies across the country of young people standing up and not knowing what they're talking about. To if young people understand the horrors that our community or country caused for certain populations, those populations will protest and riot. Or on the other side of that, people who aren't in those populations will feel guilty and feel bad about themselves because people that looked like them and identified in the way they did mean things to people in the past. So we should just not talk about it at all. So I don't know, like, it's hard for me to kind of follow any of those out. I will say all of those things are about this deep. Like, they don't even go underneath the surface. They're just things to cause fear, and they made them immediately very partisan. So to fight them, you were being partisan. One of the things that came up was around censorship in the classroom, and this was something that I would just never waver on, is that our First Amendment protects our students in our classrooms as much as it does anyone else. And so to punish a student for asking a question of a teacher, or to punish the teacher for standing there and accepting or even listening to a question of a student about history or literature or things like that, it's just absolutely across the board wrong. So those are the ways I've experienced it. I mean, and to the point of like people not wanting young people to understand how to make a statement at a school board meeting. Texas has a law now where students cannot talk to an elected official or about contemporary policy that would currently impact them for a course that they would receive a grade, even extra credit for. They can't talk about those things at all. Well, it's really important that students at every level, particularly in middle school and high school, have access to their school board members. Well, their school board members are elected officials. They can't even have those conversations with their school board members unless it's completely separate and outside of any kind of graded content. To me, that is a violation of not just your First Amendment right, but your full participation in democracy. I mean, those school board members are literally governing how they learn and who gets access to what. So I will continue to be on this journey to help people understand that it's not as simple as causing, it ends up just revealing people's biases and prejudices to begin with. Because what they're saying now about young people is what they've been saying about certain populations from the beginning. When we started redlining, all of those things, when we had the literacy test for elections, it's the same thing. We've just now decided, well, that looks bad, but maybe we could go to the classroom. And particularly in our public schools, where public schools are regulated with a lot more scrutiny than our non-public schools. That doesn't mean they're better or worse. It's just a fact. They are regulated a lot. Which means these regulations impact our public school students to a greater degree than they do our private school students. You can look at the demographics in any urban area or suburban area in Oklahoma and see who that is that's being disenfranchised. Those are just facts.
Thank you so much for all of that incredible information and your thoughts. Before we close out, do you have anything at all that you would like to add? Any comments or any last thoughts?
I really don't. You all have done such a great job. I appreciate the opportunity. I think it's just really important that everyone, for whatever generation they're a part of, is continuing to keep elevating these topics and how they impact their generation. Because this intergenerational stuff is really good for a lot of things. But when it comes to where we are as a democracy, where we are as a community, where we are as a country, it really does, you look at your peers around you and, what world do you want to create? And do you want to be a part of the creation of that? Or do you want to sit back, do your thing, and have it created for you? And I think the more that people step up and get engaged and are participating, that's what they're afraid of when that's what they're trying to stop. So I really appreciate all that you're doing. And of course, any way I can help you all in the future, just let me know. You have my information.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
For sure.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming on, and have a great rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.